Thank you all very much, and thanks for coming back again so promptly. So what I'm suggesting now is if we just take 4 very brief reports back from the rapporteurs from the 4 groups, about 5 minutes each, and then we'll wrap up what has been a long but very productive day, I think. Who's the guinea pig first out of the hatch?
I don't know whether I can do this justice, so what I would say is that if you don't think I've got the headlines right, just shout at anyone who's in my group, because writing and taking it in at the same time is not easy. Just to acknowledge that I think everyone in this group was representing an organisation, and I think that that's a sort of important frame to put round the discussion and the outcome of that discussion. So in other words, we didn't have any independent artists, if you like, in the group who might be at some point subject to this regulation, which is a word that we didn't like at all. So the headlines, I think, of our group were, we had a lot of discussion about inclusivity and making sure that all genres of dance were covered, and that practitioners working in, I think what one person described as a niche, or I can't remember what the term was, niche genres were also included, and how to make that happen. We didn't come to any firm conclusions on that, but that was definitely a headline. There was a definite consensus that we don't think this should be a fellowship by invitation type body, and that it should start from a place of wanting to include as broadly as possible. Given that, we also felt that it was really important that that the organisation had teeth, and that therefore there was a need to balance those two things, which obviously isn't the easiest thing to do, but that should be sorry, but that should be a headline. We also touched on the idea of it being a lighter model, a light touch model, and I think we liked the idea of a model that didn't have only one route in. So going back to the idea of the climbing frame, that was something that people definitely thought was useful, that you could enter this model at different levels and at different points, but that wherever you entered there was a very clear path to where you wanted to get. We use the word meritology. Meritocracy. I've spelt that completely wrong. Meritocracy. That was a word that came through quite strongly in terms of the ethos of this group. In terms of a few things that it might include, we didn't have a huge amount of time to go into any detail on this, but we did talk about the idea of there being some way of recording or gathering feedback on the teacher's work. So some way of, if they've taught a workshop, that people who've been participants in that workshop or people who've commissioned that workshop can then feedback via this regulatory body, that word that we don't like to use. We also wondered if there, on the other flip side of that, there also needed to be some sort of whistleblowing mechanism for bad practice. And then we had a little bit of a discussion about what kind of CPD. We talked about qualifications in CPD, and I think, again, there was a consensus that this shouldn't be just about qualifications, but that CPD was as important, and we talked about looking at a very broad range of good practice in terms of CPD. So things that were mentioned were action learning sets, for example, that if somebody was a member of an action learning set, that could be counted, that could have CPD points, if you like, or somebody who was being mentored. And the importance of of drawing up an inclusive list of CPD within this model. We also talked about how to get people in, given that it's easier to get people in than it is to get people out. And finally, we came back to question 1, which was, do we think this is a good idea? Given there was a resounding yes to that, but we don't want the word regulatory or framework. Definitely don't want the word, yeah. Dance was okay, but regulation is not. Oh, something else that I think was a headline actually that I should have said was something that we came back to several times was the importance of this being transparent, that it gives the profession a transparency to people outside the profession. So, local authorities and funders and commissioners of the work, that it gives them a window into good practice within dance. Is that pretty much fair enough?
Okay. We did have some echoes. We talked about teeth as well. We'd have to be aware of how sharp and how hard. And we also talked about different entry points. They were just the similarities. Do we think it's a good idea? Generally, yes. There were lots of provisos, though. We talked a bit about you'd need to have another organisation to run this, or would you? That would need to be funded somehow through subscription. We said if we did have a regulatory framework, though, there'd need to be kind of a culture shift in the thinking of both the employers and the practitioners to kind of embrace it and make it worthwhile. Second question, would it be useful to you, and if so, how? Generally, yes, it would be useful. Some ideas, it was felt that young up-and-coming people, practitioners, could use the framework to figure out what they already had and what they might need and help them to map themselves through a progression route in their career. It was also felt that we talked a lot about money in our group and how we could afford to do things, and we did say that we would hope that such a framework would give value to the profession and therefore give the practitioners confidence to be able to charge a certain rate because they could see where they fitted and what they were worth. And sort of alongside that, in terms of what might be included on the framework specifically, we talked about would we want to include alongside it a sort of marketplace assessment and a kind of comparison of kind of where you fit alongside other professions, so you could see what you should charge in certain circumstances. And I know that at Dance UK we're always getting asked what people should charge for things, so I think that'd be useful. What else do we want to see included? We were talking about it would be something that would embrace what's out there already. It's not about necessarily creating new things. So it would have, we foresaw, existing qualifications that are out there, but they would have to be just mapped onto it at various different levels, hence relating back to different entry points for people onto this framework. Yes. Sorry, let me see. And it had to make sure that it takes into account the whole range of contexts that people work in. There was a bit of concern about just having one level and saying, yes, that person is qualified. It was felt quite strongly, I think, in our group that you need to kind of have a level that says you're basically qualified, and then areas that show that you've got expertise in specific contexts, because people were worried about if you could show that you're a good practitioner in youth justice, for example, that didn't mean you could work with young people necessarily, but we'd have to show that on the framework. How would you renew your registration? Would it be something that you would have to renew every so often? And if so, who would view you? Would it be peer review? Not sure how we answer that. We had a lot of questions in our group, I think. And finally, I think what should be included, as well as the qualifications and the continuing professional development, APL, accredited prior learning, in order to make current practitioners feel like it wasn't a kind of top-down imposing lots more. We need to find a way of recognising their skills at sort of point of existence of this thing. Yeah.